the opportunity to use clean energy, which is renewables, is a great opportunity, because you can again go back to the old day of energy security at a micro level rather than energy security as a country as a whole. Now you've got individual regions that can be more secure in their energy depending on the sources, and solar and wind provide that security locally.
Hi, I'm Ed Whittingham, and you're listening to Energy versus Climate, the show where my co-host David Keith, Sara Hastings-Simon, and I debate today's climate and energy challenges. Back in mid-October, David, Sara, and I had a wide-ranging conversation around several topics to do with India's energy transition with Dr. Jai Asundi. Jai is uniquely well-placed to see us through the complexity as Executive Director of the Center for Study of Science, Technology and Policy, or CSTEP, an independent Indian think tank. Jai's been at the helm of CSTEP since 2009, where he leads efforts to bridge data, modeling, and policy for India's energy and climate challenges. Before that, he spent time in academia as an assistant professor in information systems at the University of Texas at Dallas, and held a postdoctoral role at the Software Engineering Institute at Carnegie Mellon University, where he also earned his PhD. In our conversation, we dug deeply into the nature of India's electricity grid, EVs, oil and gas dependency, and where energy and geopolitics converge. Even better, David took the lead moderating for this one, as you'll hear right off the top. Now here's the show.
Jai Asundi, welcome to Energy versus Climate.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to see you again and be with all of you.
Thank you. I'm really excited, as I came back from India about 3-4 weeks ago, and I was just excited by the pace of change, the changing energy business, et cetera. And I haven't actually seen you, Jai, for a while. I think 2 years ago, I saw you in Bangalore one evening. And I'd like to just start by a second of referring to our shared heritage. I think I know you through engineering and public policy, this department at Carnegie Mellon that was completely foundational to all my professional career, changed my life, really. And you were a PhD student there, I believe, under V.S. Arunachalam. And in my travels in India, I keep meeting more of the kind of EPP Arunachalam diaspora. They're fantastic. And so maybe say a few words about Arun, who I guess died a few years ago.
Yes, Dr. Arunachalam was a physicist by training, and then accidentally jumped into material science and made his way through the Indian scientific establishments and ended up becoming the scientific advisor to the defense minister, who also used to be the prime minister during his time. And he ended up serving almost 7 prime ministers over a period of a decade. And after that decade, he actually came to Carnegie Mellon because he wanted to take a break from a lot of the bureaucratic work and get into academia once again. And he had a PhD from University of Bangor in England. And he wanted to get back to academia. And one thing that he found out at EPP was this idea that how societies can actually change with the right use of technologies at the right time, especially for development. And that motivated him to actually return to India and start the organization that I now head, called the Center for Study of Science, Technology and Policy.
It's really been terrific to see that legacy. I remember him at Carnegie Mellon and this transition from him being involved in the defense stuff and India's nuclear weapon development to I remember working with Anshu, who I'm now in contact again at Niti Aayog on biomass gasification, all these kind of practical things in Indian energy development. It was really thrilling to see. Well, turning to Indian energy, I think I want to start by asking you kind of for a snapshot of the current situation, maybe starting with the grid. Give us a sense of what is the current mix of capacity and of energy supply for first of all, starting for electricity in India.
Just like any large country, source of energy is fairly distributed. Though, of course, you have a few major sources. So, for example, India has always been a source of coal, and hence you have thermal power plants. And thermal power plants, as of recently, August 2025, you would say almost about 245 gigawatts of capacity comes from thermal power plants. And the next big component, quite surprisingly today, is from solar power, which is at about 125 gigawatts. So, it is sort of a testament that you have coal and then you have solar. And then, of course, in the middle, you do have a lot of hydro. India has a lot of rivers. So there's about 50 odd gigawatts of hydro, and then about wind power is about 52 gigawatts. So it's not kept up with solar, though it actually started off fairly strong. But with the falling prices of solar energy, it actually has. And then there are small amounts from, biopower and small hydro. And let's not also forget a very, very small component of nuclear, right? So that was a big promise that we had post-independence with Homi Bhabha and his idea of nuclear energy and being the source of energy for poor Indians. And that's where it was. So that's the broad, mix that you're seeing across the board. So coal still occupies a massive 50% odd level. And then, of course, between solar and the rest, there's 25-25. So that's the split of energy capacity in India.
That's a terrific summary. And I understand solar's growing very fast. Maybe we'll get to maybe oil and liquid fuels later because we're kind of connections to Canada. But one useful number that Canadians, I think, will not be familiar with is what's the cost of natural gas in like dollars a gigajoule. And we're used to costs of just a few dollars a gigajoule. And I think it's going to be a lot higher there.
Let me caveat all the conversation that we are having is that, as CSTEP, we do a lot more work on renewable energy. So a lot of the work in fossil fuels is sort of stuff that we rely on others on the data sources. And it's something that we've put together fairly quickly. And, as far as gas is concerned, one of the numbers that I saw recently was this thing where the ministry, because a lot of the gas fields are under ministries and they're under government control, they have a notification on how much a price of gas will be. And so they've notified it to be somewhere in the order of about $6 or $7 per MMBTU, which comes out to about $6 per gigajoule. In comparison, I know Canada is at about $1.5 per gigajoule. So you're talking about multiples in terms of the cost associated with gas. So that's the comparison I can say between India and Canada.
And maybe one last kind of big picture thing, an impression that I got very strongly at this big meeting I was at Kochi with a bunch of Indian sort of senior development people was this sense that the really rapid growth of solar, especially, but other renewables, but solar dominant, is certainly partly about climate, but partly it's really about energy security. The sense that it can really reduce energy imports. Am I reading that right?
Absolutely. In fact, the opportunity for distributed energy is through a lot of renewables, and people have been talking about biomass energy all along. India has been using biomass energy for millennia. And now, of course, the opportunity to use clean energy, which is renewables, is a great opportunity because you can again go back to the old day of energy security at a micro level rather than energy security as a country as a whole. Now you've got individual regions that can be more secure in their energy depending on the sources, and solar and wind provide that security locally. So while we may definitely talk about the climate question, I think the energy security question is a bigger one that has always been on the top of most people's minds.
Well, let me jump into electric vehicles, and Sara may come in a minute, but I was struck that I didn't see very many electric vehicles on my trip. Obviously, there's been, as probably many Canadian listeners won't know, this amazing conversion to CNG, uptake of CNG, and especially these three-wheel scooters and other vehicles. But relatively few electric vehicles on the cities. And I was traveling with people who work in the Ministry of Transport and were involved with this, and they had a bunch of what I felt were kind of bureaucratic answers about they need some big complicated way to build recharging stations. And yet, especially for two-wheel vehicles, that is, Sara has been sending us some data, are like just this huge fraction of total energy use and transportation. Two-wheel vehicles, even the big ones, have like 2 kilowatt-hour batteries, and those can easily be charged by regular wall plugs. And I don't need to tell you, all around Delhi or any city, there's all these very poor people sitting on the street selling things. And it seems like it'd be very easy to have them sell a plug connection and meter it without any, just kind of bottom up Indian capitalism, no complicated certifications. And that would allow you to recharge a huge number of two-wheelers without a lot of new bureaucracy. So I guess I mean, am I right that it's slow? And if so, why?
The initial aspect is the fact that the cost of electric vehicles is on the high side. That especially if you are looking for capacity. So it's a combination question. Is that if you take a small bike, then you have range issues. That is, you can't go very far because the batteries are smaller. And as the battery size increases, you're spending a lot of the cost of the vehicle goes up. That said, I think it is an ecosystem play, right? I mean, today people are used to taking out their vehicle, and they know that any road they take, within a certain number of miles, they will find a gas station. And I think that's a very big part of it. While, and this is obviously anecdotal, when I talk to a lot of people who do buy regular vehicles, I ask them why, and they say, well, we travel to these places. And so while the penetration or the uptake of electric vehicles in the big cities is quite big, and I see a lot in my areas, of course, but these are also, I have found it by and large to be the wealthier people buying electric vehicles rather than people looking at it from a total cost of ownership and saying, oh, this is actually cheaper, and so we can do this. I think there are some of those issues related to not just range anxiety, but also the issue about charging stations. So let's leave the four-wheelers aside because you need dedicated, but the two-wheeler, as you pointed out, definitely. But at the same time, I think in many of these places, many people have a challenge related to parking and parking close to a charging place. So some of those challenges obviously come up. And I think, I honestly have not seen any research to say why people are or not. And, it's something that we would definitely want to see, the uptake being greater, because it also contributes to better air quality, especially in certain parts of the country where the grid emission factor is fairly low.
So I'm struck by the fact that all that you just said is basically exactly the same as the story in Canada or the US. Richer people buying them, range anxiety, parking close to recharging, all those same issues. Although, of course, India is really different because there's far more of these two and three wheelers as a fraction of transportation. Maybe what I'd like to do is turn it over to Sara first and then Ed, get some questions on the table. Then I want to come back to this question of managing grid intermittency, where I heard some really exciting stuff about grid reform.
Great. Thanks, David. Yeah, I have a couple areas I wanted to touch on, maybe just picking up from the one on electric vehicles. So I know that, as David said, I think it is interesting how it's the same kind of challenges that we're seeing worldwide. And we, of course, see progress despite those challenges being made. I know that there's some targets in India around the two and three wheelers to be electric. I think I read something like 80%. The goal is 80% of two and three wheelers purchases should be electric by 2030, which is not dissimilar from the kinds of targets people are talking about, say, here in Canada, where at least for now we have a 2035 electric vehicle mandate, which is a little up in the air, but in principle. And so I'm curious if you think that that's achievable, or what else it's going to take to get there, say, to that kind of target.
Like I mentioned, I mean, it's an ecosystem play. One is, of course, the more people adopt electric vehicles, the more people will see the general acceptability of the electric vehicle and the fact that it is working and it's fine. There were concerns at some point in time about accidents and fires, which actually happened with certain vehicles. So safety is always an issue. But otherwise, I think it's an ecosystem play. Once people see that there's availability of charging stations, ability to charge the vehicles at various places, because again, if you've got limited slots and by the time you reach there, they're occupied, then what do you do for 1 hour or that period of time? And so I think people also are very conscious of how much time. I mean, they're getting on a two-wheeler because they want to save time. If they're ending up wasting time, then it defeats that purpose. So people have their own sense of when to transition, and they take their time to do that. What will be needed, of course, is this idea of building out better infrastructure, better ways. I think there are some entities that are coming up with this idea that we will do battery swapping. So you buy the vehicle without the battery, and then so there are different business models that can actually accelerate what you're talking about, is this 80% sales of two-wheelers being electric. So I'll just give you a climate sense here, is that a few years ago, CSTEP actually worked with their local distribution company to set up a charging station for electric vehicles, which was purely charged by solar panels. And they had solar panels on the roof, and we created an electronic system that basically says that whenever a person comes to charge, it will draw power from the panels. And when there's nobody charging, then the power goes to the grid. So we're also not, doing that sleight of hand, which is saying that, power is from from renewables. No, we made sure that it actually, you could say that it came from the panels because the circuits were created in that manner. And, that entire enterprise won awards. Now, the thought for us was that here is a proof of concept. Hopefully people will duplicate it and repeat it elsewhere. Unfortunately, we've not seen much of that. And I'm waiting,
Yeah, again, sounds quite similar. I mean, I think also it's interesting that you say that it's the purchases are going to the wealthy people first, because to me that indicates also sort of a desire to, somehow these are desirable options to drive an EV when people have that choice and an ability.
This EV conversation is fascinating because I also saw that India has a target to try to get to not just the targets that Sara mentioned for two-wheeled and three-wheeled vehicles, for all wheeled vehicles, it's 1/3 by 2030. And it sounds like, unless I'm missing it, India has as comprehensive a plan for getting there as many rich industrialized Western countries, which is to say not very comprehensive at all. A great aspirational target. And I say this as an EV owner and I've got a nice Ioniq 5 Hyundai that I managed to get secondhand, so it was within my price range earlier in the year, but just recently went out to 2 charging stations, and both of them failed to charge my vehicle because, according to Hyundai Canada, because of a software issue. So even here, where we have lots of charging infrastructure, it still has a long way to go. But sorry, that's a preamble to actually then talk about oil and oil imports in India. We live in an oil and gas producing region of Canada, and we often hear all sorts of wild and woolly predictions from the oil and gas crowd about different countries and supposedly their voracious appetite for Canadian energy projects and energy products, including oil and gas. And so I do hear about India, and especially now that we're seeing China oil consumption really leveling off, that people talk about India in terms of being the new China in terms of oil consumption, and that its surge is expected any day now. But when I actually look at actual import data, it looks like the growth has been very uneven in recent years. And it doesn't show this big surge and picking up the slack from where China is leaving off. And I wonder if you have any comment on that. And is it, I'm kind of surmising, is it because India's economy is just less oil dependent, has fewer oil intensive sectors than China's economy? And I'm thinking of construction and chemicals in particular.
Oil has always been expensive in India, and I think the government has also made sure that they have continued to place tariffs on oil. So, in fact, we sometimes feel insulated from any price fall in the international market. That said, I think there is a serious concern from the perspective of energy security. So, if you look at the energy mix that comes from, for electricity, that comes from oil and gas, it's very, very, very low, right? It's absolutely very low, and majority is coming from coal. And I don't think that is ever going to be the source of electricity, at least for India, because of the fact that we do not have any natural supplies of oil. Now, in terms of gas, there have been some gas finds, but I think the priority today, as far as gas is concerned, has been to provide clean cooking fuel. I think that's a big win for health and other issues. And so the priority has been on actually laying, piped natural gas networks in urban areas. In fact, my apartment here in Bangalore got its piped natural gas supply after the building was constructed. So it was not like it was part of the construction. In fact, I was living here for almost 4 to 5 years, and suddenly the Gas Authority of India, as they're called, which has the sort of monopoly on city gas distribution, they came and they said, okay, we can put it up in your apartment complex. Who all wants to sign up? And I was surprised that only 50 or 60% of the people signed up. And, the traditional way in India to cook food in urban areas has been through gas in cylinders, which is liquefied petroleum gas, which is what we call LPG. And then, of course, what comes in the pipelines is piped natural gas. Slight difference in the type of gas that is pumped in these places. Now, I think the priority is going to be for that, and it's also going to be for chemicals. So if you look at the IEA's report, I think talks about it, and they talk about that majority of the gas is going to be used for, again, chemicals and these things. And while they also talk about the growth rate increasing and going to be higher than the rest of the country, my sense is that the absolute number is not going to exceed what some of these other countries, like China, is consuming. I think China is fairly high already. So I think in some ways, I think the bigger sense that we get in India, and sometimes we only get to hear it from the same sources that anyone else gets, is that energy security is a serious concern. And I think that's going to be driving the energy choices, and which is why was India so keen to go through nuclear energy and go through the fast breeder reactor program, is because they had abundant supplies of thorium. So that's energy security, and sovereignty is a very important aspect that I think policymakers are sort of constantly thinking about, probably, and that's what drives the decisions.
Yeah, but on nuclear, you said India is very keen, and partly because of its thorium reserves, but it's also, as you said earlier, it's a very small share of its electricity grid. But coming back to oil and gas and critical minerals and security, I wonder so in your view, which of those dependencies pose the greatest strategic risk over the next decade? Like who is India most worried about being dependent on, and for what?
I think it's the critical energy materials, and the concern is global, and I think everyone knows where its majority of it is coming from, and I think that is a concern even in India. That is the dependency, and which is why there are certain import restrictions on certain items, and we always in all our work there is a component which is called the domestic content requirement for some of these things in tenders, and so they're trying to make sure that there is more. The word we use here is called indigenization. I know it's not a word in English, but it's something that we've been using and I've been growing up with. So for me, it's part of the Indian language now, is this idea of always developing something on your own and finding it local, which is why there are these production linked schemes that also talk about how much domestic content is there in the supply.
I want to turn to markets and grids, and then we'll kind of come back to some of the oil and gas stuff. We've got a very political Canadian question at the end about gas substitution. So let's take it as a given that solar is going to keep getting cheaper. There's this amazing excitement about building solar in India. It's happening really fast. There's talk about hundreds and hundreds of gigawatts. Unless you disagree, let's assume that batteries are definitely making great progress, but batteries are not going to make the intermittency problem go away anytime soon. So the issue is how to manage the fact that we got very cheap solar, but it's intermittent. And there's two parts of that. Obviously, one is building out the actual grid transmission infrastructure so we can move power longer distances. And the other one, it's all about demand flexibility, about getting, a lot of, in some states, I guess, lots of energy for water pumping for agriculture. And that obviously can pretty easily follow solar load. Places that building cooling and some industry can follow solar load. Maybe this is easy for a rich, privileged person to say, but it feels to me like in a place where there's a lot of very poor people, their willingness to just consume less or not have electricity on some days, it's not the the great answer in the long run, but it again provides more flexibility. And when I was there at this ARTHA meeting in Kochi, I heard some really exciting stuff that India might start a really, really new process for allowing essentially entity on the grid to buy and sell. And I kind of want to hear more about that. And maybe just mention beforehand, I guess, a precursor to that or an analog is some listeners may have heard, India had this extraordinary change in its financial system where they had the government didn't impose it. The government built a standard that all sorts of different payment processors can come to that suddenly made India have in many ways a slicker, easier banking system than Canada or the US in an integrated way where everybody has access. And my understanding is that the idea is to do the kind of same thing but I'd like you to take over and tell me what your understanding is of this plan and how seriously you take it.
Yeah, so there is this, and it's actually very, very recent, this notion of the digital energy grid. And the idea is that the way digital systems created this, I would say, leapfrogging innovation in banking and finance, the thought is that is something that we could do in energy, because energy is the lifeblood of any country, society, and also a source for development. Let's start with something important. That is, in 2013, India actually integrated its entire grid. That means there's one common grid for the entire country. So any energy sold in Tamil Nadu can be bought in some other state in another part of the country, and you can figure out how to make energy flows happen. So it's not like they're all disconnected pieces. Prior to that, you had situations where the wind developers used to have to shut down their plants because they could not sell power to the grid. And now it's possible to transfer it. So this brings the aspect of a very robust grid more important. Now, you talk about intermittency, but you also need to understand that sometimes you can also take advantage of the different geographies, places that there's abundant solar may not need the energy, they can actually ship it to parts that need the energy. So there is that ability to do those things is or does fall on the grid. You have grid at different levels. You get down to the lowest level. The question then becomes, is essentially the example that I pointed out, was that can you have a person who's got, say, a solar panel and wants to sell that energy to a person who's got an electric vehicle? Can we do that? How do we do that? And I think that conversation is being had internally. There's something called the Unified Energy Interface, which is, again, the question of that protocol being talked about is, can you have a protocol that all providers and all recipients will use that protocol to exchange information about energy products and also exchange information about transactions, which is you now use the financial network to finish the transaction, right? So you've transacted on this on the energy side, and then you use this to transaction on the money side. Now, these are all right now a little early, and we feel that this is something that we are still working through. There are issues related to safety. They're related to regulation. There are issues related to all of that we will need to figure out and make it happen, because I think there's immense potential in being able to do that, because you might be able to suddenly provide a means of livelihood to a whole slew of people now who will say, okay, I could do this as part of my work. And so that's I would say the broad aspect of this digital and energy coming together, right? Where you could see that happening and actually making a profound change in the ecosystem. I hope that answered your question. And if there's something that I missed, please let me know.
No, it answered it well. I mean, the big picture answer, I think, is that you take this idea seriously. And that means a lot to me, because I was a newcomer. When I went to this meeting, there was this talk on basically smart grids. That wasn't quite the word. And my eyes kind of rolled, because frankly, there's a lot of overhype. And I thought, oh, I know about this. This won't be that impressive. And I was totally wrong. It was a really interesting talk. And I think this sense that India can make these big changes in a way that I think is very hard to imagine in Canada or the US, where bureaucracy are just more stuck. And I think that if India really did that in this environment with rapid growth of solar, it could really unleash the ability to do demand management in a cost-effective way, in a way that could be just really exciting and world-leading. And I came away really excited about it.
This is where I tell many of my colleagues is that some of these things are incredibly hard to imagine for most of us, despite being deeply steeped in technology. For a good example, I mean, I don't know whether you saw people transacting using the Unified Payment Interface, the UPI code, and it's a QR code where you can pay people small amounts of money. Of course, in the US, you call it Venmo, but that means that the person, of course, has to have a bank account. It's here too, but here it's become so seamless that you have illiterate people also. I mean, not that we have too many of them, but you can have an illiterate person be part of this transaction without having to know how to read or write. They just know how to use a smartphone. Of course, 10 years ago, I did not have a smartphone. So, I'm probably part of the 1 or the 5 percentile of the country, and I didn't have a smartphone. So to imagine every vendor, street vendor, middle-class person, or a person below middle class having a smartphone, unimaginable, right? And here we are 10 years later and we almost take it for granted. So which is why I sometimes feel that I'm not the best person to crystal gaze, because we are too skeptical given the challenges that we have seen in the technology development. But then there is a whole host of people that figure out how to make it really smooth and really easy and actually make it happen. So yes, of course, you do need that government push, not that a policy push that is needed. Like we talked about the UPI. What the government also did was that they built the platform. That was the difference. It was not just that they said, here is the protocol. They also said, we will build the platform that you guys can leverage or sit on. And actually today, there are a lot of discussions going on is that the government is spending a lot of money on that platform. How should they monetize it? Because our transactions today, when I transfer you $1 or $100 or $1,000, I pay nothing, right? So now but there's a cost associated with who's paying for that. And I think that's a conversation that's being had. And maybe that's the public good that maybe the government needs to pay for. But then, of course, the question becomes is that there are people who use it more than others. And I think I don't want to get into an economics argument here now.
So I'll pass this to Sara. I'll pass it to Sara in 1 sec, actually. And we want to get this question to sort of about about Pierre Poilievre's questions about natural gas. I'll pass that to Sara. But first, just a little anecdote that's not about energy, but picks up on the stuff you said about the payment infrastructure and illiterate people using it. So at this meeting I was at in Kochi, there was a very senior woman, I apologize for giving her name, a banker, and she was very concerned, and her bank was working on the fact that fraud through AI has become frighteningly easy. And as she said, people in villages had a way to deal with each other and do transactions, and now suddenly they're in a world where there are digital fakes and frauds that they can't imagine that are pouring in. And because this system works so well, a farmer can transfer most of their life savings very quickly from their phone, and it's I guess a serious problem. But I think that that's an anecdote. The big point here is that the Indian government established a standard, and that standard energized private industry and transactions in this amazing way, and it could happen for electricity. Over to you, Sara.
Yeah, and before I get to this other question, I just wanted to pick up on something, David, you were saying in response, which was this idea that things can happen in a way we can't imagine here because of bureaucracy. And I think that here being in Canada, and I think it's a good catch-all word for a lot of different things that are going on underneath that, right? But it's sort of just this idea that when we try to apply the, things that we know from the Canadian system to this other country for the way that systems might develop, we often, inadvertently miss big things. And if I go deeper into what that, how I would describe that bureaucratic challenge, I think there is straight up bureaucracy, and there are rules that make these things harder, but there's also just the customs that come about from, in Canada, we have been managing an electricity grid that has delivered pretty reliable power to people for, going on probably 100 years now, even into rural Alberta, for example. And so that creates its own inertia and again, rightly so in some ways, right? You don't want to be wildly changing the electricity grid in kind of helter-skelter way. But I think that sometimes we miss how much, as you were saying, how much that makes it harder to adopt new technologies and new approaches that are, on paper, just straight up better because of the people that are there, right? And it's not even that they aren't, say, allowed to because of bureaucracy, but they're just not used to, or they're not incentivized to doing things in this new way. And so, really, I'm just mostly agreeing with what you're saying. But I think it is an important point when, sitting, and that I think will lead into my next question, which is, in Canada, it is very tempting to kind of look at the historical way that our energy systems evolved and kind of say, well, that it's not totally wrong that in China that sort of happened for a while early on. And then to project that forward and say, well, that's going to happen everywhere else then, when we are sitting at a time where we have these new technologies that are sort of, it is a different world than when, China was dramatically ramping up its energy demand. Maybe that leads into my next question, well, which is, what does this mean for the global demand, and in particular for India's demand for Canadians' natural gas? Because, similar to what Ed was saying earlier, when it comes to gasoline and oil products, there's sort of this big push that if the biggest thing, let's see if I can channel my peer Polyev, but I think it goes something like the best thing that Canada could do for climate is massively expand our LNG, our natural gas production, and our LNG exports, and displace coal in India with natural gas. Again, very much, going off of what has happened here in Alberta, we have gone very quickly from having a lot of coal on our grid to not. And some of that's been displaced by renewables, but a lot has been displaced by natural gas. I was interested in that question. And so with some colleagues, actually, we looked sort of at a very pipeline-based version of that, which was to say, where are the pipelines in India? And we found that, the majority, over 70% or something of coal plants in India are more than 15 kilometers from a natural gas pipeline. So essentially, you would have to build out a lot of infrastructure. But I know you also talked about, the energy security angle and all these things. So, what do you, what do you take when you hear that? Is that a promising road, either from a climate perspective or from an economic perspective for Canada? Or is that kind of missing the story?
So it's interesting that you, I think you did allude to, the background and the fact that, and I also mentioned this earlier, that energy security plays a major role. I think India has not had natural gas in its energy supply for a long period of time. It's only recent that we are starting to see a lot more natural gas because there have also been some amount of fines. So the infrastructure for natural gas, and you mentioned that, is that has been playing out. Now, in the estimates of how much natural resource is available into the future, and I think there is obviously history also. That is, I remember when renewables started making its way into the grid, there were a lot of people that said, no, coal is the right way to do it. We've always done this. We should not move on. So there's a history to that. And now, of course, people have already moved over. And, the fact that renewables, solar and wind form 25%, you're already seeing a big move. And now the government has also committed that 50% of our capacity by 2030 will come from renewables. Now, what that number will be, we don't know, because, there are estimates of it being 500, it being 450. It doesn't really matter. It's going to be 50% of the total, and that's the estimate. And from that, I think one of the things that we will see is and this is, of course, based on what we are seeing from the projections from the Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas, is that there is going to be growth. There's no doubt about gas, both from the piped natural gas or the LNG. The question is, what is it going to be used for? I don't think it's going to be used for the power sector. It'll continue to be used in transport. In fact, there is this whole notion of using LNG for trucks and trucking, and trucks use a huge amount of diesel fuel, which contributes to a huge amount of air quality problems in India. Now, that could actually make it different. Of course, there's also a conversation around electric trucks, which is another thing altogether. These are aspects that will play a role. We can share, you can take a look at some of the projections that the ministry has already said. And they're saying that, natural gas will grow considerably. Of course, commercial sectors will grow at a particular rate. And of course, industry will grow at a particular rate. And so by and large, there is a sentiment that gas consumption is definitely on the rise. It is going to grow. Where it's going to come from is the real question. And I think that's where the infrastructure on LNG terminals and all that other starts playing out. And then there'll be the question of how will it be shipped across the country, which brings back to your original question of, do we have the pipelines to be able to do that?
So just to sharpen up, so this gentleman, Pierre Poilievre, a potential next prime minister in Canada, a leader conservative, he would say we should export gas as an environmental measure because that will actually drive down global emissions. And I think what I'm hearing from you is if there was much more Canadian gas exports and so prices for LNG fell at the margin, India would be importing more gas at the margin. Economics works. But I think what I'm hearing from you is it would be very unlikely a substitute for coal. That would be used in petrochemicals, or they would substitute for oil. So in fact, it would tend to then drive down oil prices at the margin. Is that a fair summary?
I would say you've captured it, at least in my mind, and logically I will say yes. In fact, that is exactly what it could be, that oil prices will end up falling, and yeah, right.
Well, from another Canadian perspective, those of us around us and Canadians are concerned about oil and gas exports and who's buying. I know there's another export that Canada sends to India, and that's whitewater rafting guides. And I say that because my son has worked in whitewater rafting, and he has friends who have gone and they've worked on the Rishikesh and the Brahmapuri and some of those great rivers. But I'm interested in the Brahmaputra, which of course originates in China and it flows through India and Bangladesh. And getting back to energy, India, I mean, you've got China that is damming upstream, and by doing so, it affects India's hydro, its irrigation, its seasonal flows. And one hears about that in the news from time to time. What is the latest when it comes to India-China regulations, when it comes to these major transboundary rivers that India really depends on, not just for energy, but also for other parts of the economy?
Yeah, well, Ed, you have to ask me one question that's above my pay grade too, right? So this is that one. My sense is that, these are issues that will constantly be happening in the Indo-Gangetic plain, be it India, China, be it Indo-Pakistan, be it Indo-Bhutan. As you know, we export power to Bhutan and help them with their energy needs. Small country, but, you're helping them. So, I have seen the Brahmaputra once. And one thing that hit me was how large that river was. And I can't imagine damming that river up. Obviously, it's upstream and they're damming up a different part, but it's a massive river. And it is, as they say, the lifeline of that entire region. It covers and it goes all the way into Bangladesh where it meets with the Ganges. And I feel that there are obviously concerns, especially given those areas are also prone to earthquakes because the plate shifting between the Indian plate and the Asian plate meeting and then and shifting. So I think there are concerns around safety. When you dam up a river, you have a lot of concerns there, and I'm sure the respective ministries on either side are talking about it. I don't know whether we will see any resolution in the public domain, but again, like I said, there has to be one question that's above my pay grade, and this is it.
Well, you seeing the Brahmaputra once is once more than I've seen it. I would love to see it in the Ganges and the Rishikesh and the Brahmapuri. But yes, I gather they are massive, and I hear the scuttlebutt again from these rafting guides who come back and say these are the most spectacular and wild rivers.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I saw it from far, I was like, wow. You're just in awe because on a map it looks like something, but then when you go there and see it, and then you get the magnitude of how big that river is, and it's powerful. And by the way, you should look into. There is this particular tour that you can do for 10 days where they will take you to a place, and then you just on a boat, get down the river, and you keep stopping at various stops, eating local foods and stuff like that, and continue. So,
well, maybe we'll end it there. Thank you so much. And just I'll promote Indian tourism too. The pace of change is just amazing, and the sense of energy, both physical energy and political energy for change is really exciting. So thank you so much for talking to us a bit, Jay.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Thanks, Ed. Thanks, David. It was wonderful talking to you, and look forward to meeting you guys soon.
Thanks for listening to Energy versus Climate. The show is created by David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and me, Ed Whittingham, and produced by Amit Tandon. Our title and show music is The Wind Up by Brian Lips. This season of Energy versus Climate is produced with support from the North Family Foundation, the Conscon Foundation, and you, our generous listeners. Sign up for updates and exclusive webinar access at energyversusclimate.com and review and rate us on your favorite podcast platform. If you enjoyed this episode, check out our show from Season 6, Episode 13, called Energy Transition in Africa and Its Climate Dilemma, with Dr. Rose Matiso, Research Director at the Energy for Growth Hub.